Okay. So I teach at UCSD in the visual arts department, and I taught for years at private art schools, and so I feel a little bit hypersensitive to sort of the sort of difference in teaching in a public university. But the idea of a truly public university is currently endangered, and I think it's important to protect. The expanded conversations and collaborations, I think, can open up really special interchanges between the arts and sciences. And specifically, the visual arts department at UCSD is merging with the structural materials and engineering department and nanotechnology in a building adjacent to our studios. I'm sorry if I'm talking like an auctioneer, but I realize I put too much stuff in here. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to try to keep this pace. But, okay, so anyways, but trying to pick up a little bit where, so they are sort of in direct proximity to the research and practice of these other sort of material cultural disciplines, which I think is really particularly interesting to sculpture students. And as John showed, it's really important to be able to say, look at the trajectory of production from the natural world to the built world. So it sort of creates a really nice situation. Anyways, and then just to other disciplines there that I think are really, really close, I mean, almost uncanny in their sameness or similarities to sort of the terms and the way that we talk about sculpture. The night before last, I gave a talk with a colleague of mine, Rafael Nunez, who's the director of the Embodied Cognition Lab at UCSD. And his research demonstrates how people start conceiving of abstraction and co-create multiple spatial construals, like bodily spatial metaphors, undertake collective sense-making and language based on the body and space. And actually, that's kind of his description of it, so you can see how similar that language is. Teaching sculpture students something similar. I tell my students to go see forms enacted in occupied real worlds. I ask them, all the time we ask each other, how do we spatialize meaning for non-spatial things, such as time? So a really interesting example, just from this talk the other night, that I thought it might be interesting to mention. One of the things he studies in his field research is sort of exceptions to spatial construals. And specifically, he was talking about how all known languages that have been studied are found to spatialize time along one or another egocentric axis, right? So overall, the structure of deactic time, which is egocentric time, right? Our concept of time is actually located in our core, appears to be represented as a linear axis. So with some really interesting exceptions. So one of the languages that he studies is the Amaya language. It's a peoples in the Andes. And what they do is they've sort of changed the spatial construal of how we sort of gesturally and through speech and writing talk about the future and the past. So they've reversed this polarity. We all think of the future as ahead of us, of our bodies, right? And the past behind, and they have the reversed concept of time, where the past is in front of them and the future is behind. So just if you think about it, it's everywhere. In language, it's in your bodies, it's in your gestures, right? Where we say things like, oh, we're getting close to summer, or we'll say summer is almost here, right? So either way, either summer is coming close to us or we're moving close to sculpture, right? So it's kind of a beautiful thing to sort of realize how, well, actually, how that can be undone by certain cultures, these sort of same understandings of space and time. And for me, when he sort of explained the reason for that, they see future as the past in front of them because they can see their memories, they have a visual idea of what the past is, so of course it's in front of you. In the future you cannot see, so of course it's behind you, behind the head, behind the body parts that would see. So just that little bit of information sort of created a real perceptual shift for me. Oh my God. Okay, sorry, I will just skip ahead. I knew this was going to happen, even in the auctioneer voice. All right, I'm going to just wing it now. And which is really kind of, I think, what a lot of sculptors look for, right? That for a moment, like you might be able to engage, with somebody else in a perceptual shift in the way you inhabit the world. So for the longest time, it took me a long time to shake. That seemed like such a more right way to understand time and space. Also, topographically, there's another language in a group of people called the Yupno in Papua New Guinea, who actually, this is the first known case of understanding space, not on a linear axis at all, but in terms of topographic space, of an uphill and downhill topography and which they live, which is actually a bent space that has to do with the entrance schema and this sort of cosmology of where their ancestry came from. But imagine that. Imagine that there are some languages that we know nothing about that are tiny, that maybe not going to last very long, that actually conceive of the space-time, like outside of these sort of simple egocentric axes, and actually think about it in bent-spaced or in a reverse spatial polarity. It's a very, very incredibly sculptural, and there's been a lot of references to Krauss, Rosalind Krauss, and so I think, and we all sort of think about, well, I should say, we're familiar with the history of modern sculpture being sort of marked by a strong impulse to interrupt the flow of linear sequential time rather than delivering a single viewpoint or perception. A unitary pictorial effect, asking what if meaning instead of preceding experience occurs within experience. The viewer potentially circumnavigates, enacts, co-creates meaning. Time is medium in sculpture. So anyways, we all, Rodin does that, by breaking, puzzling, paralleling, resisting the idea of meaning, moving in a unidirection from an egocentric core. Anyways, all right, so I'm over time. But I was going to give another example from material sculpture studies of these Bellarmé witch bottles, where in the 1600s, there's combination to sort of protect yourself from, the witch, who could be a person. You sort of commingle your body with theirs, like their poison, your hair, your spit, your blood, in a bottle, and you bury it upside down in the thresholds of place that you're trying to protect the interior. So in the doorway, the stairwells, the windows, this sort of space of the boundary of the farmed field, right? So again, it's from the 1600s, and I came across this in this essay by Zoe Crossland about material culture. So it's so sculptural, this idea of commingling bodies in the thresholds of space. So it makes me think of the obvious. This is Hans Bellmer. These sort of bodies commingling at the thresholds of these sort of spaces, this kind of like contemporary immunization and fear of the idea of the contaminated body. So I'm almost done because I'm talking so damn fast. So I was looking for pictures of student work. Strangely, this is the only work I could find, and it was from a student of mine who was a dual major in biology and sculpture. She's really kind of exceptional. And she basically is now in pre-med, and she's going to be an obstetrician. And she was working as a doula, I think, at the time. And she built these sort of prosthetics for herself to make her into this sort of pregnant self. But I thought they were sort of beautiful because, as messy as they were, not so much like contemporary art, but she was sort of still like intact as still like almost a Madonna with her hands, and then for some strange decisions like the extra breast on the side. But she went through this whole process of sort of remaking her body and photographing it. I'm not even sure how, in the bathtub at her home, her apartment. So it was funny that those were the images I had, and I think it sort of shows the potential richness of sort of having conversations about sculpture in a sort of an interdisciplinary environment. So let me just read from this article, which is written by a material anthropologist, and it's just about the Bellarmé witch bottles. So she talks about rethinking the apparently foundational biological body as something that's continually made and unmade through practice. And then, quote, the concept of the distributed person, which allows an extension of the concept of embodiment, so that it does not rest upon a bounded and naturalized physicality, or indeed assume a unified and bounded sense of self, but can be expressed through materials that are distributed and circulated away from the body. It also leads to a focus on the senses and affective states or relationship in the construction of personhood through the material world, and directs attention to the human-animal relationships and hybrids. So I think without saying much more, you can sort of see how the idea of thinking about sculpture sort of in a post-studio world is kind of a rich thing. Okay.
So I'm Terri Burlier, and I teach at Stanford University. So I teach at a small art department where we have maybe 30 to 40 majors situated within a large research university. Most of our students are non-majors, and even though they express a strong interest in the arts, and art practice is set within a larger department that includes art history, film and media studies, documentary film design. The faculty there is also very small, with only 6 full-time faculty. And each person basically covers a traditional genre of painting, photography, electronic media, sound, sculpture. And so while many of the faculty work interdisciplinary, the most popular courses tend to be drawing and photography. And as the one full-time sculpture faculty, it's been a really nice symposium to be a part of this and to hear all the issues that are going on, which is everything that we face at Stanford as well. And so I've tried to develop special topics classes to try to draw upon the curricular interest of the student population, which tend to be science, technology, and engineering based. Also, the university has initiated in 2005 a campus-wide arts initiative, as well as cca, which is called Stanford Institute for Creativity in the Arts. And the Stanford Arts Initiative is a university-wide effort to enhance strengths in existing arts programs, create new arts facilities and opportunities for students and faculty, and integrate the arts throughout the university life. The Stanford Institute for Creativity in the Arts is the institutional home for the multidisciplinary programming connected to the Arts Initiative. It provides support for faculty and students, activities, and serves as a hub for our campus-wide and programming. The university at large encourages and supports interdisciplinary research and innovation, and the arts are no exception. Let's see. With this in mind, I'd like to give a specific example of how I've tried to integrate sculpture into a large university and to accommodate the non-art majors that are interested in sculpture but have very little flexibility in their curriculums. Because we don't tend to have, students don't tend to take a sequential sculpture 1, 2, 3, 4. There's not that kind of a student population for that. And of the maybe 30 or 40 art majors, you maybe have a couple that are predominantly involved in sculpture. And so people are more interested in sort of special topics classes. I developed a kinetic sculpture class, and it was a class I was going to teach anyways, and then through a discussion with another professor in the School of Mechanical Engineering, it started to become a larger thing. And the idea was to bring engineering and art students together to expand on our skill sets, both conceptual and technical. And by working with a different visiting artist, each year we were able to secure cca funding from this Stanford Institute for Creativity in the Arts to fund the projects and to make them a little bit larger than maybe a 10-week student budget class could afford. And the first class that I did this, we worked with kinetic sculptor Ruben Margolin, who's based in Berkeley. And so the images I have are of this class. And so the students worked in 4 teams of 4 throughout the quarter and utilized both the Sculpture Lab, which I imagine is similar to most of yours, as well as there's another lab on campus called the Product Realization Lab, or the PRL. which is housed in engineering, and it has more fabrication equipment like a laser cutter, metal lathes, and mills. Most of the engineering students were familiar with the more fabrication type of shop, and the art students were obviously more familiar with the sculpture lab. And so what happened there was the way that experimentation happens within those two labs is very different. So the sculpture lab invites more experimentation and failure, whereas the fabrication lab, or the PRL, is very process-driven and design or product-driven. We also were able to secure through working with the artist, and he had another commission to do a piece for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, and so we were able to exhibit the piece after the 10-week class for 9 months at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and that set some of the parameters for the project. And the students were involved with from the beginning of the project, of the design, and then the fabrication of each individual part. And then a couple of the students worked past the class into the summer and helped to install the piece. And I think some of the more successful aspects of the course were this idea of collaboration. And that we were all working on one group project. And there was also a really strong interest for the students to work on something that had a life outside of the university or outside of Stanford. Like they were really connected to this, for them it seemed like bigger than a 10-week project that would end up in the garbage or something. And there was a lot of interdisciplinary work that was going on there in terms of skill sharing. And the class was done, there's quite a demand for the class, and so we've been able to offer it each year since then. We worked with Timken, the German sound sculptor based in Seattle, the year after that, and then next year we're going to be working with Bernie LaBelle, and we're going to be able to exhibit that at the Exploratorium in San Francisco. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
This is really, really great to be here today. And unlike Groucho Marx, this is a club I would join if I was asked. So my talk is called Swiss Army Knife, or the Multi-Tool Instructor. And I'll read most of this probably. At Calarts, we began teaching entry-level courses by medium for the BFA 1 and 2 students about 10 years ago. Painting, drawing, alternative practices, time-based studio, print and digital media, and sculpture. Those are the basic ones that we started with. And though we find these courses helpful in acclimating our new BFAs to our program and to the various labs on campus, we do not extend the idea of medium-based progression of courses after this initial entry point. There are no set syllabi for these entry-level courses. Each faculty member or visiting faculty member teaches their course as they wish, though there is an idea that they need to introduce students to the basic tools and techniques and help familiarize them to working in the various labs. More than likely, contemporary and historical works are shown over the semester, and most likely also crits are held of the work created during the courses. The Calarts Sculpture Lab is called the Super Shop, and it is an awesome place to build sculptures because of the wide variety of well-maintained machine and hand tools. In addition, there is a lab director who is patient and willing to instruct students. But in teaching this beginning course, as Shirley spoke about, and I think Jessica Rath is in the audience, and she just did it last semester, and I do it every couple of years, the variety of tools and techniques can be daunting for both students and myself. I make an effort to be a multi-tool instructor, but I can only effectively teach this course by limiting the types of tools. In my case, I tend to limit to one side of the shop, which is the woodworking tools, or the wood side of the shop. There's a wood shop and a metal shop, and in the middle is a layout room. And by restricting materials they can build their sculptures with. One assignment I give them is they can use one 2x4, usually I provide that, another only to objects from the 99-cent store, and so on. Though there are limits with materials, the assignments are very open-ended as to what they want to build, or pulverize, or melt, or fuse together, or grind up and put in the air conditioning system. True. But even with these restrictions, I'm constantly discussing solutions for adhesion, finish, attachment, balance, mechanization, and so forth, and teaching, and ultimately also teaching the safe use of many types of tools. Because of this, I usually give myself the task of learning the basics of a new tool or techniques over the summer. But maybe the two most important tools for any multi-tooled instructor to learn are flexibility and improvisation. Improvisation and flexibility, flexibility and improvisation. This may be because of my arise from my background in did it die? Did I turn it down? No. You can still hear me? Okay, good, sorry. I'm so nervous. Hold on one second. Okay, better. As you could tell, I have a great background in performance. I'm very, very calm in front of people. Flexibility and improvisation do aid in giving practical advice for the building of sculptures, and I think most of us who teach sculpture have all been there. I can't afford 200 feet of electric cable. What do I do now? How can I remove paint from this bicycle I found at my dorm? What's a good alternative to using goose fat? And I didn't think it would explode. In the lab, the multi-tool instructor is always scrambling to keep up, make do, and help students see their projects through. But flexibility and improvisation really come to the fore in critique. Given that sculpture is a sort of gathering pond, sometimes I switched gathering pond to cesspool and cesspool back to gathering pond. It was how I was feeling at the time. For a multitude types of works, installation, public art, social practice, performance with objects, and the list goes on and on now. The multi-tool instructor needs to be light on their feet by having at least a smattering of knowledge of the issues, forms, and concepts in these ultimately different fields. Okay, it'll be done. But when deep knowledge in an area is needed and mine is lacking, which it often is, I find this is where flexibility and improvisation help me out. Flexibility releases the rule breaker in me, and improvisation allows for great invention. I can go against the expectations set up within the critique structure by bringing information and ideas from yet other mediums in order to discuss the work at hand. And I can forge new and seemingly digressive paths that hopefully lead back to the work that is being critiqued. Some might say that I'm only giving myself license to be a kook, but I'm always aware that the work in front of me comes first, and that I, as an instructor, may be using my specific methods in my critiques, but the student or students are my audience. So flexibility equals patience. Equals acceptance, equals, to borrow from Jeff Koons, the new. Improvisation equals possibilities, equals invention, and equals energy. My method is but that obscure implement on the back of the Swiss Army knife. Thank you.
Hey everybody, I'm Alison Smith, teaching in sculpture here, currently the chair, and this has just been such an exciting day, so many great ideas. I wanted to talk a little bit about radiance and warmth work. Sculpture teaches us what it means to be in the world. Martin Heidegger writes that through advances in science and technology, all distances in time and space are shrinking, yet instant information brings no nearness. We succeed in reaching nearness, he proposes, by attending to things. In his musings on the nature of a simple jug, Heidegger looks not to representation, but instead to the thing's function, how it is made, the material from which it is made, and the processes of the maker, connecting these ultimately to the jug's ability to enliven conviviality through its proclivity for gathering, holding, giving, and outpouring. For Heidegger, things begin at their limits, for it is here that they enter into relationships with the rest of the world. Importantly, thing in German can refer both to an object as well as a gathering to deliberate on a contested matter. His writings on sculpture amplify the relationship between the body and space, no longer one of the present body occupying empty space, but something more participatory, collaborative, mediated, and welcoming. Space itself must be understood materially as a medium of exchange. To be in this world is to be ever entering a material space of radiance. A similar idea can be found in the warmth work of Joseph Beuys, whose expanded concept of art extends to the invisible material used by everyone every day. Social sculpture considers art's potential to shape society and transform the environment in which we live. Beuys defined the social sculptor as someone who creates structures in society using a combination of will, thought, speech, action, and object. For Claude Lévi-Strauss, material things are goods to think with. Objects are provocations to thought. Ariana Padarai writes that from a theoretical point of view, human actors encode things with significance. But from a methodological point of view, it is the things in motion that illuminate their human and social context. Michel Serres theorizes the quasi-object, which, like a hot potato or a ball in a game, when it's being passed, it defines the collective. If it stops, it makes the individual. Thing theorist Bill Brown writes, "We look through objects to see what they disclose about history, society, nature, or culture, above all, what they disclose about us. But we only catch a glimpse of things." Glenn Adamson defines craft as knowing how to make something through a detailed engagement with materials and process. Craft deals with the physical and involves tooling. But he also proposes craft not as a defined practice, but a way of thinking through practices of all kinds. Craft should be seen in action. Craft always exists in motion. Richard Sennett writes about the dignity of craftsmanship as seen through pragmatism, a movement to make philosophical sense of concrete experience. He argues for the value of experience understood as craft. The making of physical things provides insight into the techniques of experience that can shape our dealings with others. Craft work, he says, turns the craftsman outward. So I had a feeling that we would be looking at some diagrams today. No one has put up the Rosalind Krauss diagram, which is kind of liberating. But that's part of the reason why I wanted to mention these theorists, because all of them seem to describe an idea of sculpture as something radiant, moving from things, like objects or gatherings, to techniques, like molding or shaping the world, from materials, like felt or maybe fat, to skills, including people skills. Perhaps the problem with Rosalind Krauss's diagram for us now is that it evokes the image of the expanded field as a field. While we hold images of landscape and architecture in our minds, perhaps the field of sculpture is too easily confused with a flat piece of property. But sculpture is not territorial, but rather a vantage point within a set of contingent horizons, or better yet, a vast constellation, one that would transform this diagram into a 3D animation. But for now, suffice it to say that sculpture is like the little black diamond at the center of this diagram. It is a point within a kaleidoscope of many expanded, overlapping fields.
I perceived, as the shape came nearer, sight tremendous and abhorred, that it was the wretch whom I had created. I start my advanced sculpture class with Dr. Frankenstein upon reuniting with his murderous monster. What artist doesn't want their work to live in one sense or another? Frankenstein is both a literal and a metaphorical rendition of that. At around the same time that Frankenstein went into print, Goethe finished Faust. Faust makes a pact with the devil in exchange for knowledge of the true essence of life. This is a 19th century engraving of Faust's assistant making a homunculus. Derivations of homunculi throughout history are still in play, from the alchemist's quest to create a person, to monsters, puppets, golems, to the future of genetically engineered life, clones, and artificial intelligence. The ancient alchemists were looking for the philosopher's stone, the prime matter from which they believed life might be manufactured. The word elixir derives from the Arabic al-iksir, or the liquid version of the philosopher's stone. Gabir ibn Hayyan from 8th century Persia is both the father of modern chemistry and the origin of the word gibberish. On one hand, we're zeroing in on it, the stuff that is the basis of all things. On the other hand, we don't know how neurons make meaning. This is an illustration of the homunculus argument in theory of the brain studies. A simple theory of vision is that light rays form an image on the retina and something in the brain looks at them. The homunculus argument negates this theory because you still need a homunculus in the brain to see the image. And then you're caught in the black hole of who is reading the visual for the little person in the brain. If you have to revert to the stubborn fantasy of the little person inside you that pulls the levers, then you haven't explained anything, or not completely. I think of sculpture as an intermediary in the so-called mind-body problem. As the philosopher Gilbert Ryle said, there is no ghost in the machine. Ryle meant the inverse of a sci-fi computer that becomes sentient. For Ryle, the human body is the machine and the ghost is the silly idea that there is some other ineffable thing in the body that is, quote, mind or soul, whereas actually there are only physical chemical processes. So, to get students thinking about these thresholds between inside and outside, literal and metaphorical, I have them measure their own sensory homunculus. If you've never heard of this, your lips are more sensitive than your knees because there are more sense receptors in your lips. So more brain space is devoted to lips. The cartoon above illustrates body parts proportionally to the amount of sense receptors in those parts and thus brain space represented by those parts. Once the students have collected their data, they can do whatever they want with it, translate it into something material, try to train some part of their sensory homunculus, wherever it takes them. Consciousness is constantly juggling symbols in our heads from sensory input. We can't help but make meaning, ascribing motives, moral values, subjectivity, even to geometry. You may have seen the Heider symbol demonstration, where in a simple animation of two triangles, a circle, and a box, a drama unfolds. Not only do we have no trouble projecting an inner life on those dumb shapes, we couldn't help it if we tried. In fact, that symbol manipulation, that process of making meaning with metaphors, has physical effects on the brain and body. Researchers are calling this embodiment. Biologist and neurologist Robert Sapolsky says, when you think of something shameful that you've done, you are stimulating the same part of your brain that physical disgust inhabits. If you are holding a warm drink, you are more likely to have warm feelings towards me, the converse for icy drinks. If you have something heavy in your lap now, you're more likely to consider these ideas weighty. Sapolsky says this neural confusion about the literal versus the metaphorical gives symbols enormous power, including the power to make peace. On occasion, sculpture has carried that power to major consequences. Consider the terracotta army from 210 BC China as homunculi that indeed actually saved lives. It took a few hundred years for Confucius's arguments against the blood sacrifice of royal mass live burials to convince an emperor to have a terracotta army buried instead. The Moai of Easter Island destroyed rather than saved a population. The 100-ton heads were quarried from the middle of the island, but how were they moved without making use of trees? Pre-Moai, the island was 80% forest. Post-Moai, no forest and almost no people. Easter Islanders completely exhausted their resources building and moving Moai. So, mind-body metaphors matter. This is a picture of the stress the UC student body is under. Without a ballot initiative rescue, California higher education will take yet another hit. Fine arts everywhere are going to have to fight for their place on university campuses as the humanities continue to get squeezed. What is the place of the fine arts on a public research university campus? At UCLA, the South Campus houses science while the humanities are north. The architects for the undergraduate art facility renovation described the building as the primary gateway to North Campus. That organizing principle, the metaphor of a gateway, opens a great opportunity to ask students, what is the relationship of the fine arts to the rest of the liberal arts? Are we a gateway, an essential passage, or are we fringe on the far end of some spectrum of the liberal arts and sciences? There aren't any fixed answers. It's the aspirations and scale of the metaphors they yield that matters. On the right is a computer model of the approximately 10,000 neuron connections in a pinhead-sized area of your brain. Replicating the quadrillion connections of a whole brain is decades away, let alone encoding thought and memory. Then MIT researcher Sebastian Sung might have the answer to his question, how do you put together dumb cells and get something smart? Trade the word cells for wood or metal or any other material and you could be talking about sculpture. How do you put together dumb material and get something smart? Of the fine arts, I think sculpture is the most forthright collision between the literal and the metaphorical. Consider the Moai and the Terracotta Army as cautions. These collisions of metaphor and life could still go either way. We may still do ourselves in by squandering irreplaceable resources like the isolated Easter Islanders. Consciousness could still turn out to be of no evolutionary advantage. That is, if humankind does do itself in. It's hard to imagine artists playing much of a role in that now, but you never know. If metaphors continue to matter, just considering the matter could make a difference. Thanks very much for letting me present.
I wished I'd thought of sending a video in my stead. What a great idea. And he seemed so articulate. And I'm going to just be kind of puzzling through a lot of questions that I have about exiting the academy, behind the curve and under the gun. That just thinking about what a student, artist, person might want to take away, that whole notion of mind-numbing notion of learning outcomes, doesn't really begin to address all of the questions that we're thinking about. The fact that academies, by their very nature, are always behind the curve. What we teach, what we think the world is going to be like, the kind of work that we're so engaged in addressing in our own lives and also intellectually in the community. And what is going on in the art world is really not the world that the students are going to be going out into. How do we determine what's relevant? And we've all talked about this a lot today, about what, the hugeness of the endeavor that we're thinking about trying to facilitate. Any material, any situation that's viable seems to be worth doing in art making. And what is the world the students are going to be entering? Are they going to be working with galleries? Are they going to be working with museums? Are they going to be artists in cooperative situations? How expansive are the resources that we're giving them? How do we foster curiosity, diligence, dedication, risk-taking, intellectual ambition? We're preparing artists for a world that we'd have no sense of, that we can only guess about. I can know what I did when I got out of school, which was pretty radical and unusual and completely different from what is available at this moment in time. Started a commune up in the mountains in Colorado, spent time in New York with an artists cooperative, and continued to maintain this community of artists up in the mountains. I worked as a plumber, I worked sewed for a designer. I tried to do everything I could to just keep making my work. Teaching came later to me. how do we think about preparing a student for a lifetime of making? What would sustain their practice? What can keep you going? Is that so completely tied to the so-called art profession? And what about environmental concerns? How much time do we spend while students are in school talking about toxic materials, or the very real threat of our carbon-based economy just completely doing us all in at the same time? And what about gender? What about the role of gender and the kinds of work that artists are making? We've touched on this a little bit in time, but the whole sense of art, craft, abstract, ephemeral materials, physical materials, geometry, structure, all of these things have specific gender meanings. And you know, I remember recently reading about the Bauhaus, and that women entering the Bauhaus were not allowed to study painting or sculpture. They had to study craft. Annie Albers wanted to be a painter, but she had to study weaving. Thanks to Annie Albers, weaving is an extraordinary craft now, an extraordinary art. But the whole notion that only certain kinds of things were available to women carries a residue throughout the world around us. So how do we address that in school? How do we begin to teach women and men to be human beings in the world? And what is the place of making in a digital world? I ask myself this all the time. How can we preserve time for crafting, honing skills, direct observation, when students also need to learn digital modeling, video editing, Photoshop, and proposal skills? And exiting begins at entry, obviously. You don't just button it all up at the end and throw students out in the world. But the minute they come in the door, we're thinking about what they need. And how do we continue to keep this alive? How do we continue to ask ourselves questions about it? It's easy to build a curriculum around just making skills and techniques. It's also easy to build a curriculum just around ideas, but how do you begin to get students to be doing both things at the same time? How do you get them to find their own thinking? That seems really crucial, and that should happen the first year students are at school. They should be not just coming up with great solutions to the problems we think of, they should be making up their own assignments in some way, and this should be fostered throughout the whole time that they're in school. And then the big question for me, and I think for all of us, is: are we just training people to be artists in the art world? And you know those statistics they all told us when we first started art school about, well, only 1 in 20 of you are going to be making art in a year after you get out of school. I found those things so offensive. For one thing, they were very discouraging for anybody who really wanted to have a life as a creative thinker and maker. But also, it really talks about what is the art world, what is the place of art in the world, and is there only one way to do it? Is there a way that artistic thinking can benefit the person who is in that class, whether they become an artist or not? Buckminster Fuller, a hero of my generation, said something very simple at one point, and he said to look around and see what needs to be done, and with the abilities you have, set about doing it. And look at what's not being covered, look at what other people aren't doing, and find out what to do and how to do it. And that takes a kind of creative mind, and I really like to think that those other 19 students in our classes who aren't going to be art stars are really seriously participating in the world, using the kinds of skills and ideas that we foster. We can't teach them everything, and a lot of these things aren't teachable, but we can make room for them to happen. Time is short. In school. 4 years is nothing. When you think about, that's sort of the under the gun part of my talk. We are under the gun to really prepare people to be in the world. And the only way that we can do that is to try and get them to create a life of curiosity, of learning, of research. What do I value? I keep coming back to those things. What do I value? What do I think students need? What do I think people need? What do I need? And a curious mind and intellectual ambition. Trust in one's own thinking and visions, in the small whispers in the mind. Those are really hard to foster in a critical classroom setting when you have a half-baked idea. And I think we all as artists know those half-baked ideas are the ones that really begin to become something. A deep connection to making as a way of investigating ideas. The ability to research ideas, histories, materials, techniques. Being a member of a community of artists, thinkers, problem solvers, provocateurs. A room of one's own, or the moral equivalent. A place to be where you take your thinking seriously. The appropriate use of a discerning critical eye and critical thinking. The ability to notice when something is happening and the courage to run with it. That thing that wasn't what you intended, that is happening out of the corner of your eye, but carries greater meaning than you could have come up with yourself. How do you notice it? How do you take it seriously? And what's already been mentioned, maneuverability, adaptability, nimbleness, insight, foresight, without losing conviction. How do you shift? How do you allow yourself to function in the world? I mean, in my long life as an artist, there have been so many kinds of work being made. There's so many kinds of work were supreme and completely overran the work that came before it. And why we do that, I have no idea. Why do we eat our own? It makes no sense. But the fact that work that was completely pushed when I was a student was very quickly over with once I was out in the world. I mean, if I had not had my own sense of what I was interested in and how to go about finding it, or if I wasn't able to cobble together a way of doing that, I don't know how I could survive. So just very quickly, we try to foster these things. I try different things every year. It seems to me, I've been teaching a while now, and every year I come to it as if I never went and taught a class before in my life. And I don't do that as a practice. It just happens to me. I think, oh my God, I keep having those homework dreams that you have when you're in school, like, oh, I forgot to do my homework, and like, oh God, I forgot to figure out what this class is going to be about. But it's helpful to try and keep it alive, for me. You know, we do various things in senior project that I think are really important in terms of exhibitions. Students have at least one-person exhibitions, so they can really play with them. It's not their one card they have to play. We try to get them to think about community, to create a community among themselves, to work with each other, to have critique groups. You know, we have them documenting all their work throughout their time here, and we critique the documentation, and we talk about, oh, that's a stupid photograph. That doesn't, you know, it might be a great piece, but that's not a great way. You know, we're trying to give them some so-called professional skills, trying to introduce them to galleries, try to introduce them to museums, etc., and also introducing them to artists and how artists live and cooperatives. Talk a little bit about graduate school. You know, more than a little bit. We get them together with the graduate students here at our school. They come and do critiques. We take them to studio visits. We talk about the usefulness of graduate school and the various kinds of schools. We help mentor the process. But when you think of yourself out in the world, and when you think of all of the kinds of things that you need to know, I think the most important thing that any of us can do as teachers is think of ourselves as artists first and model our teaching on that premise. what do we want to talk about? You know, what's interesting to me right now in the world, in my life, in my work, and how can I get people to talk about that in my class? Not talk about my work, but how can we focus on those kinds of issues that are very real and very alive? And then how can that become a model? How can we model for our students what a life in art making might be? Not a life as an art teacher, which I think is an incredibly important and wonderful profession that I love dearly. It was not my intention to become a teacher, and I've come to it kind of reluctantly, and now I've been at it for quite a long time. But I think that the notion of being a model as a person who has gotten away with having a life, following one's own curiosity, is a really important way to help guide students out of the academy. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. What's my name? How did I get here? This talk is called Learning to Forget, Sculpture in the Soul Kitchen of the Academy. I've been listening loudly to all the excellent stuff that's been put forth so far, and I think one of the things that's really compelling is we're trying to imagine what the future of sculpture education might be like, and one way to do that might be to talk about what the future student is going to be like. We know just in Los Angeles in 2009 and 2010, LAUSD cut their arts programs by 60%. And in 2013, they proposed to cut 100% more. So there'll be no arts programs in Los Angeles Unified School District. Students are going to be coming to university with even less knowledge about art. In 1980, the state of California built one new since 1980, the state of California has built one new university and 20 new prisons. So the kind of institutionalization that's really making money or conditioning people is starting to change. So I think what we end up wanting to teach is going to be something that provides liberation rather than incarceration in terms of, say, thought and their lives. One of the things I wanted to concentrate on was the unlearning of obstacles that culture and previous education can create. So using sculpture as a mirror for human culture, I'll attempt a comparison contrast of the belief systems that gave birth to the first academy in Athens and today as ours might exist in academia at university. In ancient Greece, the belief system at the birth of the academy in Athens can be characterized as a maternal eternalist belief system. That is, matrilineal, believed in reincarnation and the concept of Atman, or in higher beings. In fact, they had a pantheon of gods. And the most renowned image of their time was the sculpture of Athena Parthenos, which was 40 feet tall. And this is a recreation in our own Nashville, Tennessee. And the original one, the kind of sculpture is called a chryselephantine, which the flesh was made of ivory. There was tons and tons of gold, those like poundage, tons of gold in here in bronze with a wood armature. And this sculpture is large, it was public, and it was also rumored to be in a pool of virgin olive oil. Using two of the oldest systems of thought, the Taoist medicinal theory and Vedic theory, if we look at the materials that were used here, they all happen to be male. So you could say in terms of representation, the sculpture is obviously female, but on the inside, it's male on the inside, which is kind of fascinating. So also at this time, Plato is teaching the Socratic method, that man should question the world around him. And this harbored, according to Joseph Campbell, this harbored harbored a turn from nature towards a kind of city intellectualism. So today at university, it's interesting to try and speculate on what our current belief system is. I'm going to call it an infantile, nihilistic, materialist belief system, which is patrilineal, non-Atman, generally does not believe in higher self or reincarnation. And this sculpture was done in 2011. It's 3 inches by 3 inches by 4 inches. It's private in someone's coffers somewhere, unless you happen to be in Hong Kong in 2011 at Gagosian. And it's not gender specific on the outside in terms of its representation, but upon the same Vedic and Taoist analysis of its materials, which is cast platinum and diamonds, these are actually female. They're actually talismans for the planet Venus and the goddess of love. So authorship existed in ancient Greece and as it does today. And if we imagine that our belief system is actually infantile in a way, we want to imagine how do young children who haven't yet been culturally conditioned in this lifetime see the world and reflect it in their own art making. This drawing was done by a girl named Nadia when she was 5 years old, and at that time she was diagnosed with a kind of cancer that gave her only 5 weeks to live. So her drawing is the line work, and then there's an icon, isotype icon of a little girl inserted in there. Concepts of originality and newness. From Webster's New World Dictionary, new means, the first definition is never existing before, just come into being, possession or use. And the second definition means beginning again. So on one hand we have never existing before, and the next one says beginning again. Starting a repetition or cycle, i.e. new moon, new year, something that signifies a continuing or eternal process. So we still have this alternating kind of male-female, eternalist, nihilistic duality kind of functioning inside of our culture. The next point for comparison under these two belief systems is what is education for? And I chose to really specify, to kind of dig into what education is like in America today. It's based on five themes. One of them is a particular religious worldview that's basically Calvinist or puritanical, which is based on a religion of exile that says humankind is corrupt and must be turned from rebellion into willing obedience to God. It's important, excuse me, to note that the Puritans were the first to mandate mandatory literacy for children so they could study the Bible and the laws of capital. The next theme in American education is a Cartesian and Baconian based thought system that relies on a fascination with power or power of concept, science, and technology, and stresses a mechanistic, reductionist, and material mentality. So Bacon is responsible for division of church and state, Descartes' definition, deification of thought and ego, I think therefore I am, and the Cartesian coordinate system and analytical geometry that are considered to be a critical link in modern day computer technology. We have a restrained, fake democratic ideology, capitalism, nationalism. Those aren't that interesting to talk about. There is this point of the psychoanalytic idea of reparenting. When a young adult goes off to university, psychoanalytic, specifically psychodynamic theory, talks about that this is a process of reparenting. And I think this is starting to come together in terms of seeing like a mother figure and a child figure and how we imagine our kind of like symbolic upbringing. And the next point, kind of tertiary point of comparison I used was the hierarchy of transmission of information. So how do we get educated? How is information actually transmitted? So there's a hierarchy that anthropologist and Greek scholar J.P. Vernat, Carl Jung, Freud, and Joseph Campbell all agree on. This one states that oral, written, and conceptual transmission are the lowest. They're every grade usage that includes thoughts, and that's the dimension of logos. Then we have a symbolic transmission, which is dimension of transcendence, which is that which thoughts and words do not reach. And this is where sculpture is. This is where art is. Other things that are on the same level of transmission of information are dreams and auspicious events, signs, and mythology. And Carl Jung wanted to know by what mythology he was living by, and he didn't know, and that actually became his pursuit, his life pursuit. According to Joseph Campbell, mythos' primary function is to put one in accord with nature and their thoughts. The last highest part of transmission of information is called direct transmission, and that's usually used in spiritual community, shamanistic community, indigenous culture, which traditionally communicated something that's transmitted from a guru to a student that is a permission, a gate, a rite of passage, says that your debts are settled and it allows you or enables you to move forth. So the last point of comparison I have is what is culture for? And according to anthropologist Clifford Geertz, he emphasizes that culture is essentially a system for a social group to define meaning, where meaning is, number one, the scope of reality. This is what culture teaches us. The scope of reality. Number two, nature, what nature is. And number three, human possibility, what we can achieve in a human lifetime, or what's worth working for. So to close, I have a quote from Andrei Tarkovsky from his film Stalker, from the artist character in his film Stalker. When man is born, he is weak and flexible. When he dies, he is hard and insensitive. When a tree is growing, it is tender and pliant, but when it is dry and hard, it dies. Hardness and strength are death's companions. Pliancy and weakness are expressions of the freshness of being. Thank you.
Hi. Are you still hanging in there? I'm Dee Hibbert-Jones. I actually work at UC Santa Cruz in the art department. And I'm also a founder of the Social Practice Research Center that just started there. So I actually was one of the people. Terri said if you didn't give a title quickly enough, she would assign one based upon your interests, and this was mine. I was like, whoa. So I'm covering everything within 5 minutes. So forgive my kind of like spanning through things. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm actually just going to show some of my students, undergrad student images of sculpture that they're making and the kind of breadth of that as I'm talking about ideas. Thinking about this conference and pondering a shift the sculpture area at UC Santa Cruz will have to make this year as our budget shrinks and our class sizes increase. This quarter, I'm teaching a Sculpture 1 class. It's got 25 students in it. We actually just increased that from 20. And next quarter, that class will be 50, and I'll have to teach it as a lecture course, which is actually a studio-based lecture course taught by TAs. So it's the only way we can preserve our upper division classes. So different conversation, but just thinking about those. And that was actually one of the things I was thinking about. How do you expand sculpture where decreasing budget sizes relate to that? So I began writing lists of questions for myself, which I'd like to list as a starting point for later discussion, and as a way to introduce my own position in relation to the teaching of sculpture. So how do you teach sculpture for the present and the future as our relationships to objects, labor, and production shift so dramatically? Now that knowledge production is the US predominant export and mass industrial production in some parts of the world has been replaced by handmade objects that look mass-produced, think iPad or iPhone. As new media and technology impact the making and using of functional and non-functional objects, do we shift emphasis and teach mechatronics, electronics, design virtual objects in SketchUp, use 3D modeling and 3D printers to make objects that defy Cartesian geometry. As the revival of craft takes place in art world, do we continue to teach traditional skills, introduce craft skills, process-based participatory practices, or the notion that ecological self-sufficiency and environmental consciousness have brought these sculptural methods to the fore? When stitch and bitch becomes a way to make friends, and social networking has moved beyond the networking tool into a business model, what is the role of sculpture in the expanded field? Do we, for that matter, continue to encourage students to buy products en masse from Home Depot, fabricate in wood, cast plaster, weld, build found object installations, and fabricate things that end up as landfill by the end of the quarter? As land and environmental issues become more and more key concerns for us all, should sculpture be business as usual? Should sculpture exist at all as a discrete category as all arts fields expand? For myself, I've started to frame art making in terms of cultural, social, and political context, and open up discussion of these areas alongside conceptual art historical movements and skill building. And I want to just say one thing about that in relation to the conversation we started before last, it was at the end of the last section. I always think about the art, the kind of like trajectory of contemporary art being a bit like watching a soap on TV, or in some ways trying to follow what's happening in the political world right now. And so you can say, why is that man not talking to his wife, about their baby? Well, you see, it's not his baby because she was abducted by an alien, etc. And so why is that pile of vomit on the floor now a valuable sculptural art piece? And so you can actually talk about those conversations. And I felt that was something was missing in relation to that concept of like technique and concept. But there's also this kind of like, if you don't know the story, then you really have a hard time with that. And the fundamental classes, it seems to me, need to encourage or kind of include that. And that's not so much an art historical framing as it is a kind of like what's happening. Equally and oppositely, what's happening in the world is the reason why those things have actually started happening. So that's kind of the dialogue I'm thinking to myself. So to wonder with students how these larger issues reflect and should be reflected through symbolic and knowledge production. I come to think about the recent proliferation of collaborative practices and non-art practices in artwork as part of a cyclical paradigm shift within the field of art, as Grant Kester suggests in his recent book, The One and the Many. And I wanted to end this with a series of questions with a quote from Kester. This is, for example, a student project where a student of ours went out into the area around Santa Cruz and just started building this project inside and outside of the space, thinking about what those notions are about calamity and collapse as the housing crisis happened. So I'm ending this with a series of questions which he suggests the uncertainty in the field can offer options for new, exciting ways for artwork to be taught and made. This is the quote. As the history of modernism has repeatedly demonstrated, the greatest potential for transforming and re-energizing artistic practice is often realized precisely at those points where its established identity is most seriously at risk. So I hope that through today's discussion we'll begin to see the re-energizing of the practice in light of the present crisis of sculpture and also the world. Thank you.
Hi. I'm last, and that comes with the burden of having the overwhelming, fallout of the entire conversation that has just transpired that has made me shift repeatedly improvise repeatedly on what I really think is important to say. I just wanted to show you this book that I just got, Draw It With Your Eyes Closed, The Art of the Art Assignment. And it's put out by Paper Monument, and I think it's really interesting that, the idea of education has now become the creative project in and of itself, which is exactly what's happening here. And I just want to read you one of the first assignments by Heather Hart. Take an 18 by 24 inch piece of paper and make a drawing using nothing but your car. Just love that. Anyway. And I actually went to school, undergraduate, public education, San Jose State, and in my class was Tim Hawkinson, and he did exactly that for one of his assignments. I think that if I just very informally talk about what I am trying to do as somebody who is a product of California's public educational system, I have gone through my entire education and training as an artist in the public education system. What I'm calling embedded arts or proximity research is to be the product of California's suburban post-war development history is an interesting context in and of itself. This is actually Sarah Wookie, who's a dancer at Calarts. This is one of her classes in suburbia. I just love the idea of the classroom. Also, many of you might know, this should be thrown on every desk of your department chair, your grad students on the first day. And I really loved what Rack Collective said, embedded criticality, the awareness that the cultivation of a critical relationship to one's situation is a privilege that has to be earned by an intimacy with it, not purchased by a distance from it. So this is where I've taught for the last 20 years, and I was literally a graduate student entering the world of teaching. So you understand the complexity of that kind of repetition of the education I just had being passed right onto my students. And it took me a while to figure out that mirroring was not necessarily the most productive way to prepare an artist for the future. But this is UC Santa Barbara, absolutely beautiful. There's another challenge there with students, and that we're a gated community. This is our entry gate, having very strong resonance about what's inside and what's outside, what's privileged, what's included, what's excluded. This is our student body. This is a typical lecture class at UCSB. And then you have an embedded student life. That's our beautiful coastline, and they're having their weekend. Same student. I teach a foundation class I teach what is essentially spatial studies to 120 students in a foundation class. So you're kind of getting the sense that very different starting points of education from a private art school to a public school like Santa Barbara, and that's already come out. So one of the things I just wanted to say is that having been in the institution for so long, my only choice is to consider it a kind of project, a kind of creative enterprise, and to take the materiality and the circumstances, the situational conditions, and try to repurpose it, reimagine it. And so essentially what I did in order to sort of make that paradigm shift, not only for myself but for the students, is to consider my classroom as a complete academy of its own. And what I started was a Friday class was only because if you think about the competing interests of all the other faculty in the 18 units of that student competing for your time in your class, and they're running from one class to the other, I was trying to just carve out a space that actually felt more like the space of the artist. And so Friday, no faculty teach classes on Fridays, and so Friday was wide open. And I was able to start the Friday Academy. So I'm not going to read it all here, but it's the mission statement is here, It maintains its own academic calendar. It doesn't follow any of the quarter system, which who can teach and make art under 10 weeks, 3 times a year, who can do that? So we do. But so the other thing is this, straying from a studio arts training model, the Friday Academy encourages a high turnover of art majors. That doesn't mean that we push away art majors, but that we allow for a different interdisciplinary assortment of academic refugees to join with community scholars and other professionals to collaborate. So I'm just going to show you one example. It's an early example. We've gone on to do many more things, but this one just seemed to be the most, I think, relevant to this discussion. So opening up the classroom, and the idea that me as the expert walks into the classroom and imparts something to these students, I think, oh, is that my time already? Oh, geez, okay. Is the notion of leveling the playing field, co-teaching, co-learning. I don't know any more than you do, or as Alison asked, what do the students bring to that classroom? Bodies of knowledge that I don't have, experiences that I don't have. So opening up the classroom, what's so interesting is you look at this really excited woman who said, I'm going to do this to 2 recycled shipping containers that we got as the starting point of a class. None of us knew what we were going to do with 2 8 by 20 by 20 foot shipping containers. And we actually brought in the guy who owns a shipping company as one of the consultants in the critiques. And that woman said, I want to put this sort of, kind of beautiful suite of windows, and then she actually had to do it. And what you're going to see there is Brooke actually learned to be one of the best plasma cutters in the country because she had to figure out how to work with that material. So the natural conditions of a project that's way bigger or a material that's way more daunting for any of us becomes the lesson. So we ended up doing this very kind of Gordon Matta Clark sculptural intervention at full scale, which couldn't end up in the dumpster at the end of the corridor. It's too big. So we, but what I want to try to say here is the decisions that the collective group of students made really was able to be, history and precedent, like Gordon Matta Clark's Split House, was able to be reintroduced into a classroom in a way where it's integrated into the actual daily practice of the work. Now, and so what ended up happening is we indeed turned it into a kind of full-scale sculpture that was kind of fractured and reassembled, and to create a very alternative sculpture that you could move through. But then, because the class doesn't really have a beginning and end, and it's kind of motivated by what happens next, the students actually wanted to sort of put on the table what would artists bring to the conversation around shipping containers. We had post-Katrina housing, FEMA, an excess of containers. And so the students actually repurposed cafeteria trays. Everything was, the idea is you don't go to Home Depot and buy anything new. You have to look at the sort of massive supply chain and consumption cycle and kind of understand the material world from those terms. So I'm not really, but that's it. I just wanted to show one quick example, and I think it kind of touches upon a lot of the discussion we're having and will have. Thank you.
So I want to thank the panel. This was just amazing. It's been such, for everybody, it's been such a luxurious day to just kind of be in these conversations, and it's a luxury that none of us take very often. So to just take this time is really a gift. I want to say that 2 words came up for me just hearing this, is this notion of tenacity and grit, like hard work is grit, and the tenacity of students, you know, and us working hard as leaders, and really inspiring. So now that I've had my whole body experience today, I want to introduce M.A. Greenstein. M.A. is the founder and director of GGI Institute. She is a graduate, what is your title? The graduate advisor at the Art Center and at MICA, Maryland Institute of Contemporary Art. And MA also serves a great function. A lot of people from LA have worked or know MA, but Shirley and I have something in common in that both of us went to different graduate schools in LA, but MA was one of our advisors and our mentors. So it's kind of exciting to have her come up. She spoke in the sculpture department, as Alison said, recently gave a talk on spatial intelligence and why sculpture matters more than ever. So this is our closing remarks by MA. Thank you for coming. And I can stand here. Sure.
How's everybody feeling? Yeah. It's been great, huh? It's been fantastic. So I want to ask for a second, since my own area deals with applied neuroscience, I know something that happens to the human brain when you've been sitting and listening to a lot of language. So I'm going to actually ask you for a moment just to shut your eyes. Just to shut your eyes and just take a breath for a second and just kind of feel yourself on the chair, yeah? And I'm not going to talk for a sec, just so we can all be quiet for a second, to just gather ourselves. And I would ask you to just notice what's happening to your breathing right now, and see if you can take a big, deep breath to let everything out. Let yourself say, ah, and just let it out. Yeah, it feels great. Yeah, yeah. And as you're breathing, I was just going to ask just keep your eyes closed just for one more sec. And I would ask you, if you could, to do something that we know happens in learning, to embed memory, which is called end backing, which is to go back from the very beginning of today's symposium. See if you can zoom back in your space-mobile and picture the people that spoke on stage. See if you can recall any insights from what you remember from what they said. And press on through to this afternoon. Make sure you include lunch. See if you can picture the people, picture the space where they were standing or sitting. See if you can gather any insights into what was important for you from what you've heard from this very luscious and important symposium. Let's take another moment to just reflect on your own memory for a second and embed what's important, what's valuable from today's proceedings. Be sure to swallow. Might be words that come up. Might even be a sensation or feeling in your own body. And then take another breath and let your eyes come open. Or you're always welcome to keep them closed if you want. But I think I'm going to start by first of all thanking Terri and Shirley for inviting me to be here. It's really an honor. And I'm very grateful to all my colleagues who I haven't seen in quite a long time, but who helped me grow as a professional in the Los Angeles art community. I've been known there as an arts writer and as an educator, as teaching at Claremont Graduate School was the first school I ever taught at. It was called school, now it's called university. Otis, UCLA, Art Center, and a couple visits to Calarts. Yeah. I just, full confession, I was trained as a dancer at UCLA, and that education introduced me to the field of neuroscience. And so I was trained actually in cognitive neuroscience, neurosomatics, and dance. And that template for what could be the possibility in a public education, taking Kim's words, like what the UC system has always promised, which is this idea to introduce a research perspective to artists, was so exciting to me. It was so exciting, and it stayed with me to the point where I started my own institute in 2006, 2007. And my reflections today on what you've spoken about come through my effort to make sense of a research perspective in the arts, to make sense of an art and science connection. So I'm going to see if I can summarize many of the thoughts really that have already been summarized by the last panel, and give us a picture of where we've come from in terms of our nausea, which this morning we talked about nausea, yeah? We talked about the challenge of the dilettante, and we operated on certain presumptions about what we thought sculpture is and what it should be. And in the afternoon, what I heard was excitement. Exhaustion, yes. I mean, also we ate, we had rice, we had carbs, right? We had carbs, right? So of course we're going to be tired after lunch, yeah? But I heard excitement, and I also heard rebranding, to use the language of entrepreneurialism and leadership. Yeah. And I think we have that chance now. We really do. And as I said to students, some of you were sitting here a couple weeks ago, that it's my contention that sculpture is more relevant than ever before in terms of education, in terms of business, in terms of R&D in the public realm of where entrepreneurial angel investing is going. And if you think for a second that you don't have any knowledge or preparedness when you leave a sculpture program or a media program, that you think you can't function in this environment, my thought is that you haven't been given the picture of what that could look like. Okay? So it seems to me that I want to invite my colleagues, all of us who are still working, and I still am faculty, as you've heard, at Art Center, and recently got asked to join the graduate faculty at the social design program at MICA, is that we have a chance to create a new picture for students of the 21st century. And you talked about that. you talked about that specifically as first of all, as an ethic, that it's a work ethic. I didn't hear much about party. I mean, I know a lot of sculptors. There's a lot of partying going on in sculpture. Okay, a lot of drinking, a lot of smoking, a lot of party. But we didn't talk about that for whatever reason. Yeah? We took it. Right. But am I right? Right? Yeah. So you know. Let's talk about what is relevant about sculpture. It is the area, as you've all named, that is the cross-section of all the areas of a university, for those of you in the public view, and certainly in departments of design, it's what has a natural connection to prototyping, materials, design thinking, industrial design, you know, it's even film making, right, set design. It's just, you know, it's just the area that touches all others. You talked a lot, and I think those of us in California really feel it, this pressure of the economy. And we lose our vision when we're tired. We know that just about the human brain, that when we're tired, we don't do our best processing. And when we have a general climate of depression, economic and imagination, depression in our imagination, that we forget what's really on the ground that's available to us. And what I heard and what I saw is that many of you are rethinking how to use materials and how to even use the economics of our time to work to your advantage at the level of policy, at the level of community building, right, outside in Long Beach, right? Wilmington is in Long Beach, Mario? Long Beach, yeah. So the idea is that poverty should not stop us. It never has stopped makers, yeah. And it gives us a great chance to take a breath. And I would say we probably all need, you know, just a little ride out to Joshua Tree for a while, right? Just go to the desert, right? Go to, you know, Yosemite, whatever, to take some time to let yourselves, you know, breathe and let your mind remember what you do so well. The second thing I heard was a lot of interest in crossing silos, and that this has been a very hard thing for the university. It was hard when I was a grad student, but it's our time now. We have the angel investing that's really interested in crossing silos. We have STEM grants that are there to cross silos in the national policy. And to those of us who are worried about No Child Left Behind, yippee, it's ending in 2014. Okay? And by the way, yeah, it's good, it's clapping, yes. And I was just at a seminar, a symposium down in California, down in San Diego, Create California. There are policymakers that are going to make sure that lawmakers know that there's actually a law on California books to have arts in education. Okay, so they're pushing to say you're breaking the law if you don't have arts. Yeah, it's a good thing. It's a good thing, right? So while we've heard, so I think the challenge for us is to low battery, so I better go fast. So so we've got that advantage to us, and we probably want to be just a little bit more aware of policy, what's happening, ear to the ground. We can do that, yeah. And if we can't do that, we ask somebody, you know, to get one of our students to look it up on the internet. Okay. I think there is a beginning conversation about pedagogy. I, for one, am very interested in this discussion. I think we circle around it without having a way to think about it, and I want to invite all of us to recognize that we're in the brain age. We really are. It's touching everything. And this is not just, you know, shameless self-promotion. This is a shared recognition that neuroscience is touching all areas, and particularly education, and that we now can have a really great discussion about learning in the brain, and there are forums in which to do that, and there are grants for that, and sculpture belongs in that discussion. To that end, I think that the word space is a meme for us, and it's been used by many of us, and we know so much about that. And our opportunity to partner with people across universities, as Kim's doing, which is to think about the geography department, the dance department, who, as a dancer, we always think about space, the architecture department, urban planning. The opportunity now really is for interdisciplinary. You're already pointing to it. Let's run with it, yeah? So spatial intelligence, and this is what I spoke about, this is a core area. And if I could just say for a moment, we need to understand why it's important. Talk to me about brain development, talk to me about cognitive development. We have the data. If we want to make an argument for why sculpture is relevant in the university, we're in the business of developing brains in a healthy way. we prevent Alzheimer's. Let's just do the study. There are already people interested in that. We can do the study. What do we do to contribute to preventing Alzheimer's? Okay? Because we deal with space, and that's part of, that deals with the hippocampus. Hippocampus is the area that deals with spatial intelligence. It's the first attacked by Alzheimer's. We're in the business of brain development. Okay? And I think that's a really important understanding for us in terms of recognizing the cognitive as well. Because in our interdisciplinary work, we can address, you talked about engineering, but let's also talk about the mathematicians that we can partner with, who are really interested in what we're doing. Yeah? And you pointed to that in your thinking about form. So we tend to have our own language and our own history, but in terms of being conversant and in engaged discussion with other people in other departments, that's a node that we can touch on, the art and math node, which has lots of energy around it. So let me finalize discussion about this question that I heard a lot on sculpture as self-awareness, this personal aspect, this notion of identity, this area of values that Linda spoke of, that Alison spoke to, which is taking your own thinking seriously, yeah? Which is, you know, to choose to have an education, and for us to be as educators, is that we actually recognize that we take thinking seriously. And that the other word I heard that I've heard most of my career and education, the choosing of the deep, right? The choosing of deep thinking in an age where things are moving fast and we're taught to surf and glide. Can we find a way to be more eloquent about the importance of the deep and how that serves an understanding of cognitive development, emotional development, brain development? And finally then, let me reinforce Kim's notion of leadership. It's a very important term now in terms of business development. And to think of ourselves, and what I heard us saying today was, you know, how are we going to resolve that mind-body problem, which neuroscience is doing a really good job. Genetics is doing a really good job of resolving the mind-body problem. Because we're in the world of symbolic, because we're in the world of memes, we have a chance to draw on the whole world of information processing. It's not just about developing web pages, it's that we are information processors. We are replicators of symbols, as Susan Blackmore talks about. And that we can be engaged in addressing sculpture as information. We don't have to go back to those old arguments that, we're dumb potters, or, we do our thinking through our body. I just don't, those arguments are really the 19th century arguments. They're not our arguments. Our arguments are the arguments really of information processing, of networks, right? Everything that this is, we are. We're connectors. And we are part of the great connectome, We'll help Sebastian Sung solve his problem because we know how to work with our hands, we know how to work with our minds. We're haptic, we're spatial, right? And we like to have fun, right? We like to party. So those are, right? You're right. We have to say that, it's an art school, for God's sake. So I think I covered most of what you've discussed. Yes, yeah. Anything missing? Anything burning missing? So I really, I'm honored. I'm salute you. Really, more relevant than ever. That's our mantra. More relevant than ever.